looks like we're ready.
Yes, we are.
Okay, I call the July 13th, 2022 Planning Commission meeting to order at 6:01 p.m. Ms. Pinyard, will you do the roll call, please?
Sure, thank you. Oliver Gallagher. Jennifer Willard. Present. Cameron Mesbah.
Here.
Sarah Heberlein.
Here.
Brianne Jasinski. Aaron Woods.
Here.
Andrew Carr.
Here.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Pinyard. Will staff lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance?
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. All right. So this is the time that citizens have the opportunity to address the Planning Commission regarding any item that is not already scheduled for a formal public hearing tonight. Therefore, if any member of the audience, either here in City Hall or via Zoom, would like to speak about any work session item or any other matter of concern, please raise your hand or send a message to the recorder using the Zoom chat function so that we may hear from you now. Sir Pauly, is there anybody?
Thank you, Chair. I was just going to comment that we do not have anyone in the room or on Zoom that's here to make comment outside of being a consultant or such for one of the presentations.
Okay.
So we're good to move on.
Thank you. And Mr. Pauly, I'm having a little trouble hearing you. It's not super clear.
Is that better?
It's like your mic isn't working and it's picking it up off of the area mic instead.
Okay. Mine's on. Can you hear?
Chair, can you hear me okay? This is Ryan Adams.
Yes, Mr. Adams, that's better.
But you don't want to say anything? No, you don't. How's that? Hear me?
Weird. Better.
God bless technology.
Okay, you'll have to get me worked up where I start yelling or something. So,
Okay.
no, yeah.
We'll go with it for now.
Okay.
Okay, we'll move on to administrative matters and consideration of the June 8th, 2022 Planning Commission minutes. The minutes were previously distributed. Are there any corrections that need to be made to the minutes? All right, seeing none and hearing no corrections, minutes are approved as distributed. Before we move on to the work session items, I just wanted to note for the record that Ms. Gallagher is now in attendance.
Sorry.
Good evening. Okay, let's move on to the work sessions. Looks like first up on the list is the wastewater treatment plant master plan.
Thank you, Chair. So, as you know, there's many components, utility and infrastructure components that are subcomponents of the comprehensive plan. That includes things like the wastewater treatment plant. So Mr. Mike Nicrelli, on our civil engineer, is here tonight to present that along with his consultants, which I'll let him introduce. So this is an important part to look at that critical infrastructure we have down near the river and I-5. So with that, I'll pass it off to Mr. Nicrelli.
Hello, can everybody hear me okay? Okay, good. Dave, are you able to speak? I have Dave Price with me from Carollo. Just want to make sure his audio is working.
Yeah, if you guys can hear me, I think we're set, Mike.
Okay, good. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I have just a PowerPoint presentation. So I'll try to switch this to presentation mode. I'm not the most adept at PowerPoint, so Dave, do you recall how to get rid of the sidebar? Or
if you go down on the bottom right down there, there's a little, looks like a little screen icon to the right. Click on that thing.
this one here?
Yeah, see what happens.
Okay. Everybody sees that okay?
Yep, looks great.
Okay. I think if I just hit the down arrow, it'll go to the next. Yeah. So this wastewater treatment plant master plan is the first one that's been done since the last major upgrade to the plan, which was back in 2012. So it's a little bit overdue to look at the capacity of the plant, the condition of the equipment, the regulatory landscape, and just any issues that need to be incorporated into a capital plan. So that's the main reasons for moving ahead with this plan. And we hired Carollo Engineering to do the plan. They have a very strong wastewater expertise, and so I'm going to have Dave Price from Carollo do most of this presentation. Dave, I think I'll still have to just advance the slides when you tell me to, so I'm going to go ahead and move on to the next slide.
Sure. Thanks, Mike. So, as Mike said, Carollo's, and my background specifically is in wastewater treatment and planning and design. I've done a lot of facility planning over the years in Northern California, up here in Washington and in Oregon. And we base our planning around what you all are looking at in your comprehensive plan in terms of the growth that's expected within the community. And a few years ago, you guys did a collection system master plan. In addition to that, there's that collection system master plan provides some information that we assessed and utilized as we were looking at what the needs would be for the treatment plant. So a key aspect of what we need to do is to make sure that that treatment plant's got capacity to treat in compliance with the requirements of the NPDES permit that you have to discharge to the Willamette River. And the key to this study is that we've selected the year 2045 as kind of our planning horizon. And the next slide down, Mike, if you can get to that, there we go. We show some actual population numbers on the graph on the right, and some projections. You can see also a quick little summary in that table on the left that shows our population target at 30,566 in 2045. That aligns with the reddish orange line in the chart, the solid line. That's what we used as the basis for the capacity evaluation. Those are based upon metro projections, and there has been some discussion about how aggressive those are or not aggressive those are, and so there may be a little bit more discussion that we have about that. But the other lines on there's a green dashed line and a purple line that were projections that we developed and looked at and talked a little bit with Dan last year when we were kicking off this part of the master planning effort. So Mike and I are intending to take a harder look at those numbers that show up as sort of that medium growth line that's in there. But as we go through this evening, the conclusions and the basis for what we have to present are really based on metro. And DEQ is looking for those when the plan gets submitted. They're going to want to see those, but having some additional information there on slightly different growth is advisable. You can go to the next one, Mike. So using the population figures, we do a projection of the flows and the biological organic waste loads that show up at the wastewater treatment plant. Those projections are presented here in this table. Those drive the core process needs of the plant, and the core process needs really are the biological process that removes the biodegradable organics that could cause, serious impact to the water quality of the Willamette, and that you all invested money in back in that project in 2012 and continue to invest in over time. And then in addition to those core secondary treatment processes, there are also solids that are generated by the process that are an important factor, in particular in Wilsonville, because of your ambitious goals to produce Class A, so beneficial project for beneficial reuse. And we'll talk a little bit more about this. But as you look at the table here, you can see that the metro projections that we've used result in flows, which are presented on those top three lines there, and loads that are shown there on the bottom too, which increase, 30 to 40% over what you're seeing in recent years, say in the last 2019, 2020. Mike, you want to move on? There we go. Then the other aspect of what we need to look at is what's the condition of that equipment out there in order to continue to serve the existing folks and have a firm foundation from which to build on as you expand capacity. You want to make sure that you are keeping track of the facility condition and keeping track of the age, and those are things that also drive improvements that can be capital improvements, although some of those can simply be sort of ongoing routine maintenance, repair, and replacement. We see that at the end of the planning period, 2045, you're going to have had equipment in service since your most recent upgrade that will have been out there for, over 30 years. And that's an easy thing to forget, but that's the reality. The solids facilities that you have out there in particular have had a few challenges over the last few years. I'm sure that folks are aware of that. The dryer has had some issues. There was a fire. There were some component failures at the end of 2021 that led to some challenges in producing a dry product. And there's some other dewatering equipment challenges out there as well recently. The secondary clarifiers, which remove the solids, settle the solids out from the secondary process, and return those to the secondary process or to the solids wasting and the solids processing processes. So a couple of those predate that project, and they've been out there even longer. And so the mechanical equipment in there is going to be needing attention. And your wastewater is disinfected using UV light before you discharge it, and that the equipment that was put in has been operating well, but there's a backup unit out there just in case. That one's been out there for quite a while, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, potentially needing replacement. Go ahead, Mike. Other things that could be driving expenditures out there and things that you need to plan for include things that are on the Department of Environmental Quality's mind, things that they have concerns with, and they have been concerned about temperature out there for quite some time. There's been a lot of talk about nutrients and dissolved oxygen in the Willamette River. DEQ is in the process of pushing initiatives forward to assess whether or not there are stringent limitations on the discharge that the city makes to the river and on the other dischargers in the lower Willamette. Some of those initiatives have somewhat stalled, and there has been a bit of a backlog in things like getting permits updated. So those things are out there. Those things could happen. When they happen and to what extent they would have an impact on the city are considered, but in the near-term planning horizon, we don't see anything that's going to cause a major change, but these are certainly things that could impact what the city needs to do out there, and you'll need to continue to stay in front of what the Department of Ecology is doing. Anything else you want to add there on that, Mike?
No, I think you covered the regulatory side well.
Okay. I'm going to move on. So just a little bit dive here into the condition and capacity assessment. I think the next slide has just a quick summary of what our methodology was. Carollo didn't go out and do a detailed condition assessment, but you had a couple of condition assessments that were done by consultants in 2019. Jacobs and Brown and Caldwell did evaluations out there that were pretty comprehensive, and basically what we did is we reviewed those reports and we summarized the conclusions. The key findings there were the secondary clarifier mechanisms that I mentioned earlier and the backup UV system. We also did evaluations of the plant looking at the Cascadia subduction zone, earthquake event, and looked at generally what the seismic and geotechnical concerns might have been or might be out there. We did find that there are some older buildings out there. We had a site visit by our structural team back in 2021, and there's moderate risk there, and with the current code requirements and applying the looking at it from the standpoint of the Cascadia event, there were some recommendations made to address some seismic concerns, and there are some mitigations recommended in the plan for 3 buildings, primarily the operations building, the process gallery, which has got mechanical equipment in it but can be occupied, and the workshop building. Okay. Moving on, the process capacity evaluation. We use a model to simulate the biological process plant, and we use analysis of data that provided by the operations team out there. We also will generate hydraulic tools or spreadsheet tools to evaluate hydraulics. And what we are showing in this slide really is a summary of the possible capacity concerns based upon those metro projections of population and the accompanying flows and loads projections. The secondary treatment process is going to need some attention before 2045, and that is reflected in that secondary treatment line item there. And on the right-hand column, there, you'll see where we've identified some possible alternatives, which we considered as we were working through development of the plan. But you've got a couple of secondary process elements there, that aeration basins, which all are supplied by air by the aeration blower. So you'll see 2 items there that are flagged with different dates because we're predicting that they may need attention. One might need attention sooner than the other. The plant also has a set of tertiary filters that are used prior to discharging effluent into the river. Those are more or less sufficient you have in your MTDS permit, there's some more stringent requirements on your operations, in your operations contract. And there was a bit of discussion during the development of the master plan, you know, how to address whether or not it was critical to trigger a capital improvement for those disc filters, as this table implies, just simply because of an operations contract requirement. So you'll see later that there was a decision to consider whether or not there might be some benefit to the city to consider maybe relaxing that, and that impacts the capital improvement plan, as you'll see. And then your biosolids dryer, with the history of issues out there, you know, our initial recommendation was, hey, you really need to have an emergency response, sort of an emergency management plan to try and minimize, to the extent possible, that solids are being hauled to the landfill, and you know, you're not able to beneficially reuse the product that you're generating. And then we also looked at, you know, can we provide some resiliency and some redundancy to that dryer system, as well as, as well as looking at different technologies. Technically, on paper, the dryer system has sufficient capacity for the solids that are expected to be produced by 2045 using those metro numbers. But because of some of the reliability concerns and the fact that that dryer will have been in operation for many years and is already showing some signs of wear and performance issues, we went ahead and looked at some alternatives for the city. Hey, Mike. So here we have some on our alternatives evaluation. As I said, primarily these were geared towards addressing capacity deficiencies. If a piece of equipment needs to be replaced, it needs to be replaced unless there's some sort of new whiz-bang piece of mechanical equipment to replace it. It's really replacing things in kind. So this was really focused on capacity issues out there. And what we looked at in terms of secondary process was adding a new aeration basin. There are 3 aeration basins out at the facility now. A 4th aeration basin has been recommended, in addition to some additional blower capacity. We also looked at the potential for intensification out there of the process, which means that there is not a vast amount of usable real estate out at the wastewater treatment plant site. If you haven't been out there, I think it's a fun field trip, but it's good to understand what's going on out there. And anyway, looking at that, those potential regulatory concerns, things like needing to remove nutrients at some point down the road, growth occurring at a more aggressive rate than we might anticipate with those metro numbers. We looked at some more intensive technologies and did a real deep dive into membrane biofiltration, which would add a fair bit of capacity to the system, but also is a complex process and costs a lot of money to operate and maintain. So the secondary process got a lot of attention. The tertiary filters, as I mentioned earlier, the conclusion there really was, you know, can we relax these operational limitations? Is there really a reason to hold the operator to a higher standard than the city's held by DEQ? That avoids construction of a 3rd filter unit out there, which is a considerable sum of money. And if there's continues to be issues or there's concerns in the future, that's always something that the city can revisit in terms of that decision. And then again, as I mentioned, the dryer, really not driven by so much by performance, or not so much by capacity, but more by performance. And then, looking at the process for the drying, that should say the solids process there, that last bullet, but looking at, with the performance issues with the dryer and with the dewatering centrifuges out there, maybe taking a harder look at what could be done to optimize the process to try to improve that performance, looking at the chemicals that are being added out there and making sure that there's not more that could be done to optimize that equipment. The conclusion of the CIP, I guess the punchline in the CIP and the conclusion of the evaluation really was understanding that there are a range of options that the city has available to them, some very expensive options, some expensive options, but less expensive options that include the potential of adding a second dryer out there and having some redundancy and some backup to that existing dryer. Another component that the city is going to need to consider there is how much useful life is left and in terms of sort of what's going on with the operations contract out there, and there would be just some discussions about that at some point in the future too. So I think we can move on, Mike, unless there's anything else you want to add. This is a layout that shows the alternative that's presented in the CIP for the dryer. Essentially, it would involve expanding the existing solids building at the treatment plant and adding a second dryer, not eliminating the existing dryer, but refurbishing it and more or less keeping that dryer out there as a backup. The technology that's used in these dryers here are similar. They're different manufacturers, and as with many things, involving complex processes like drying solids to the point where they can be beneficially reused, there are advancements happening all the time, and so the dryer type that we're showing here is similar to the existing dryer type, but you can imagine it's 2022, it's not 2012, and manufacturers and vendors are learning from things that have occurred over the last 10 years. I think the other thing that's an important point, as you see the bullets on here, is this is really, in the CIP right now, this is potentially the largest investment that you might need to make in this time period. Okay, Mike. So pulling together all of those capacity and condition elements, the deficiencies that we identified, this site plan sort of identifies where we've got some new infrastructure that is intended to provide additional capacity. These are shown in blue. So a new aeration basin alongside the existing aeration basins out there, lower in the mechanical building there. Then we've also got some elements of replacing existing equipment that are not altogether driven by capacity. These are shown in blue, or I'm sorry, in purple. So you've got two secondary clarifiers up at the top. There are those circular large circles that we talked about replacing mechanisms in. The backup UV is right next to that in the building number 7 there. And then the solids building showing the expansion for the redundant dryer is off to the left corner there. And then the buildings that we mentioned that would be getting seismic retrofits are shown in green. And one other little item we hadn't talked about, sort of a small ticket item, but getting a fiber optic cable, dedicated fiber optic cable out there to the operations building and improving communications there.
And that would be essentially getting from the property line over to the main administration building, and it wouldn't actually have fiber in it until the larger city project brought fiber out to the property, but this would give them a place to put it.
Hey, Mike. Yeah, this is really kind of give you some idea of what the likely schedule is. The dates in orange on here, if you can see those, really are the dates where our current analysis is predicting that you would need to have improvements in place, or to provide additional capacity, or the recommendation and the sort of collective decision, amongst the consultant team and city staff and the operations team was, hey, this date is when that needs to be in place. So you've got some decent-sized projects that need to get done soon: the UV system improvement, seismic improvements, and taking a look at whether or not there can be some optimization done on the solids that are produced in that process. Also, the secondary clarifiers. Then you've got the larger investments are shown out sort of after 2030. And as Mike and I have been discussing over the last week or so, if we take a look at a bit more aggressive growth, there's a possibility that some of those bigger investments would need to move up, earlier in the 2030s or maybe before 2030, depending on which projections that we're using. There's also the potential that there are some elements out there that we didn't identify as needing or having a capacity constraint before 2045, which could also pop up on here on this timeline. But again, the biggest investments that you have facing you are what to do about solids and the dryer, which shows up right now currently in 2031, and then the aeration basin expansion, which is shown right now in 2038.
So yeah, this is a draft document that in the next couple of weeks we're going to maybe refine this timeline a little bit, as Dave mentioned. Look, just checking against maybe some higher growth rates, and just to kind of see, maybe try to plan a little more conservatively. So by the time we finalize this document, some of these years maybe a little bit shifted.
And then this exhibit really just sort of shows, based upon our estimates of the cost of these various elements, and incorporating into this an allowance for a bit of more detailed planning for the specific project and some design work, as well as construction and equipment procurement and all that. This gives you some idea of what that looks like in terms of dollars that could potentially be spent by year. And you can see it's obvious that those red bars that show up for the dryer are considerably higher than any of the others, although that's not an insignificant investment that you see in 2036, 37, and 38 for the new aeration basin either.
And those blue ones to the right are the ones that would be most likely impacted by altering the growth rate assumptions, because the red ones are more condition driven and aren't going to necessarily be impacted by the growth rate we use.
That's right. That's right.
So I know this has been a lot of information, but I'm just kind of run over what our next steps would be. And once we do finalize the the document, we have to submit it to DEQ for review and approval. And then, we have a series of additional meetings scheduled. So we are going to present essentially this same information to council at a work session at the beginning of August. And then we have our public hearing back with Planning Commission in mid-September. And then City Council public hearings in October. And the only thing that might affect this is if, when we start looking more closely at maybe the medium growth rate, and there's some major impact on the project phasing or the capital plan. It may take us a little more time to address those, but we're not anticipating that, but that's a possibility. So with that, I'll go ahead and stop the share unless, people want me to point back to any particular slides. I can bring them back up to answer any questions.
All right. Well, Mr. Price, Mr. Narcetta, thank you very much for the presentation. We'll go ahead and open it up. Mr. Woods, I saw your hand up, so we'll go with you first.
Let's see. Dave, you were doing the slides. Can you go back to the slide that showed the projects?
Let me bring those back up here.
Oh, I'm sorry, Mike.
Yeah, I'll let Dave talk, but I'm kind of running the screen share. So the projects, let me see.
It was near the end. Keep going.
Okay.
With all the different bars?
Yeah, that one. That's right. The draft cash flow piece.
Oh, one down from here?
Yeah.
Okay.
This one here. When I look at this here, I mean, we've got a couple of projects in 23 and 24. And I'm just wondering, and this is probably a better question for staff here, is how has this been projected in our funds here, in our budget to address these? This is fairly soon here. So, and if let's see, if you can go to 15, the slide before, when we look at what is needed here and what we're looking at for these in 2023 and 24, 2023 with this fiber optic, which is extremely important coming up. I'm just wondering, from a funding standpoint, how are we looking at that to be handled?
Well, that is maybe a question more for me than for Dave. The larger, dollar amount items on there are the UV system and the secondary clarifier mechanisms. Those are both in the budget that was just adopted for, not this current fiscal year, but they are shown in the 5-year plan. So those have been taken into account. The seismic improvements, I don't know that we have yet included that in the budget, but it's Dave, I don't know if you recall offhand the amount of that one. It was significant, but maybe not as big as the others.
It was, yeah, I've got that table up right here. It's a little over, that estimate is a little over $1 million for those upgrades, and that's spread across those 3 buildings.
Okay. So, my understanding is, we've got funds in our wastewater, capital budget to accommodate that. But I don't believe we have yet, put that into the 5-year plan. So that is something we'll be doing, in this next budget cycle. The fiber optic cable addition, Dave, I recall that was a smaller. Yeah,
that's less than 60,000. $50,000 in the table here. So by comparison, it's a relatively small project.
Yeah. And then the dewatering performance optimization, you know, that's, we haven't actually put a number to that. That's something we'll probably work with Jacobs, which is our contract operator for the treatment plant, and just, you know, rely on them to participate in that. And, you know, we may provide some funding through that operations contract, but, you know, it's not something that would be, you know, have a major impact on our cash flow situation.
Okay. So, Mike, if I were to summarize, it sounds like a good amount of the near-term proposed projects are in the 5-year plan, but there are a few things that still need to be addressed. Is that accurate? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. Mr. Woods, anything else?
No, that's it. Thank you, Mike, for that.
Mm-hmm.
All right, Commissioner Carr.
Just keep it going. What's the financing plan for the 2031? Is that coming from CIP? And do we have adequate annual CIP funding to pull that one off? Because that's a bigger nut.
Yeah, that's a big one, and I probably needed to add another item on the next step slide, but I did mention, I believe, in the staff report that in this current fiscal year budget that was just adopted, we do have a project identified to do a wastewater rate study and SDC analysis. So we're going to take the results of this final master plan document and then see what those numbers and this schedule mean for the monthly rates and the system development charges, and how those might need to be adjusted. So that, you know, that's our intermediate step after those, you know, meetings that I mentioned in public hearings in the next couple of months. Over the next year, figuring out that finance plan is our next step in implementation.
Thank you.
All right, Commissioner Willard.
Hello. Okay, I had two questions. Your executive summary talked a lot about the soil piping and how that could be compromised in a seismic event. Is that part of the seismic upgrades? Would be, I assume, grouting in some way, any voids that are around the existing piping? Or is that not in your plan?
That's not included in those seismic improvements. Those are recommendations that came from the geotechnical report and the study that was done by Northwest Geotech. Those sorts of improvements are, what's the right way for me to characterize those? There isn't any, at least at the time that they did their site work, there wasn't necessarily any active erosion or any sort of piping occurring out there. So it's one of those things where when you're designing the new improvements for the aeration basin, for example, you want to pay attention to those requirements. Or if somebody's identifying something that appears that it could be an issue, if a hole shows up out there suddenly after some rain events, then somebody needs to be telling somebody, and somebody needs to be concerned about it. But I don't know that there's anything that anybody needs to be losing sleep over with regard to those currently.
Okay, I misread that section then. And my second question is around odor. I am surprised that we don't have like a backlog of projects to deal with odor. It's very close to some neighbors. I ride my bike by there, and I know there's an odor presence. And so are there many complaints over odor, and should we do any projects to address odor?
Mike, I didn't hear much feedback as we were doing this on odor, so I don't know what your knowledge is or what you know about complaints or things that folks have heard.
Yeah, it's not something I've heard much from the operators out there. I could, and it's not something I've heard Delora mention either, you know, our public works director who manages that contract.
Well, if it's not an issue, I don't want to create one. I was just curious if there was a burning concern over odor that we should be addressing.
There are odor control units or facilities that are tied to that dryer and the solids building. While I oversaw the work for the master plan, I don't tell anybody that I'm a solids processing expert, but I think that there are risks when, for example, the process is interrupted and maybe there are solids that are not making it through the dewatering process to the dryer on sort of a continual basis. That would be something that occurs because something breaks or there's something else going on that sort of interrupts the normal flow. I would say under normal operations, unless somebody was complaining, then the assumption is that the units out there are functioning the way that they were intended in terms of controlling odor.
And I might be conditioned, but just times I've been out there, you know, many times, I have not really noticed anything myself. But
okay, good.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, Commissioner Mesbah.
Related to that previous question, is the process for solids, does it include a digester with gas harvesting?
No. Dave, you can talk more about the details, but the digesters were eliminated with the last upgrade.
Right, so with the last upgrade, the city elected to remove did the city have aerobic digesters, Mike? I don't know that detail I don't remember, but there is no digestion. Solids that are dewatered, essentially raw solids, are taken from the centrifuge units and go right into that dryer unit. And all that process is intended to function sort of on a continual basis, right? All of that equipment sort of wants to operate as if it were one big conveyor belt of solids from the storage tank where the waste solids go through those digesters to dewater them and into the dryer.
And there is no plan for generating gas or anything like that in the future. That is one of the things that comes up usually in dealing with solids.
Yeah, in fact, you know, my previous job at the city of Gresham, that was a big part of the picture there, capturing the methane, producing heat and electricity from it. But yeah, just due to past decisions, and I don't know what led into the decision to eliminate the digesters with the last upgrade, but trying to go back to using anaerobic digestion, I think it would probably be prohibitive.
Now it would be, yes. And from what I understand, the process requires effective dewatering if odor ever becomes a problem. It's probably because the dewatering is incomplete. So long as you have excess moisture, you're going to have smell.
Yes, or improper digestion, yeah.
All of that was unrelated to any question that I had. It was only a follow-up.
Okay.
I was looking at your projection. Well, early in the presentation, in one of the slides, you made reference to 35% expansion or some percentage. What was that again?
So those are increases that the modeling shows, right, Dave?
In the flows.
Right, so you've got flows on the top three lines there that are, those are typical kind of statistical numbers we use. And then the loading for the solids on the ladder, on the lower two lines of that table there. So that 2045 projection is shown in that column on the right. that's approximately what that is. Well, that's what it's trying to identify. The kind of increase in potential need for capacity based upon our analysis. And using those, remember, that's using those metro numbers.
Right. So how does these percentages compare to the population increase percentage?
If you look at that slide there, you've got, yeah, this one. You've got 27,000 people, 30,000 people. I mean, you're talking about a number that's less than what those values would represent, or you would think that those values would represent in the table there. One element of that, or maybe a difference that you might perceive there, is that we're looking at specific elements of the flow or the loads, and those can I guess that if you're looking at specifically at those components that we're evaluating, we often will use numbers which are conservative numbers for the future growth and what they produce. We're not going to assume for the purposes of making sure that we're being conservative in the planning for you all, we're not going to assume the best case scenario. You're assuming that every home that's built has, whatever the comprehensive plan says, 2.7 people, or I forget what it says exactly, but it's going to assume that number, even though in reality that fluctuates depending on the household and whatnot, right? So that is an interesting element to all this as you're thinking about it.
Well, and the reason why I brought it up is that your projection is tracking exactly the same as current per capita, flows, loads, all of them. So you're assuming the same generation per capita as today for 2045. Your population growth would be 18% about, in my calculation, but your increases are twice that in all of the categories pretty much. So, I understand you're trying to be conservative.
Yeah.
And the reason why I'm bringing this up is a follow-up question here. This is not a collection system study, but what infiltration inflow analysis information do we have?
So when we do evaluations like this for a treatment facility, we'll look at the actual flows that have been received at the plant. Sometimes, depending on what the circumstance is, what the client's desires are, and what the needs of the community are, sometimes we'll take a look at the collection system model and we'll say, what's the maximum amount of flow that thing can deliver, right? But typically what we do is we look at what's actually happened in reality and do a statistical analysis, and many of these flow numbers are generated based upon evaluation using sort of rolling averages. So I don't know that we have them called out specifically in this table, but we'll often use a maximum month flow that's based upon a rolling 30-day average. This is what the average was in January over some time period, whatever that is. Often it's maybe the previous 5 years of data. But no, we don't necessarily utilize the same kinds of assumptions that they do in a collection system plan. Part of the reason is the collection system, the treatment plant, no matter how tight the site is, the perception is, or the assumption is, that you can go out and you can build some more capacity, you can expand, you can intensify. Once you put a pipe in the ground, it's very difficult to make it any larger, right? And so often a collection system plan is making some very conservative assumptions about especially the peak flows that it needs to convey to the plant, because you don't want wastewater popping up out of manholes on streets anywhere. I don't know if that helps.
That wasn't my question. My question was, do we have a handle on clear water intrusion in the system?
That's not part of what we looked at.
I know. I'm asking that from Mike, I guess.
Okay.
I believe so. I mean, yeah, the wastewater collection system master plan would have definitely looked at that. And, you know, there's a CIP that came out of that is replacing a lot of older pipes. You know, I've been involved in several projects in Charbonneau, one of our older areas, where that's been a particular issue, just the age of the infrastructure out there. So, yeah, we are definitely addressing that, and the best way to do that is to go out and either line or replace old pipes. And so, yeah.
Well, I was actually hoping to hear that you have a handle on any potential large inflow areas, not old pipes. That's, yes, you replace them. But broken lines, especially in low areas where you have shallow groundwater, and I assume some of the gravity lines are close to where that kind of water intrusion would be happening in Wilsonville. Letting in water that is not going to be efficient to treat. All of this, the kind of questions I'm asking, is trying to get a handle on whether or not, as part of the study for the treatment plant, there is a conservation plan to reduce the loads in the future as compared to assuming we're going to be as wasteful as we are today. To put it in that term, I'm not saying necessarily we're wasteful.
If we look at this slide again, you'll see that the increases for BOD and TSS are a little bit higher, especially BOD, and I think that probably does reflect that, you know, the influent is often trending stronger because we are taking less clean water, less rainwater into our system. And so we're still having to treat the same amount of solids, but the hydraulic impact isn't as severe as it would have been in years past.
We're also using more efficient.
The pipe materials are better now. The fixtures are more efficient, and the plumbing, in the building.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, but there is no program to encourage conservation and so forth?
Well, that would probably be more to do with the water distribution and the plumbing side of things. So I can't personally speak to that. It wasn't part of the scope of this project, but I think the city is definitely interested in that and pursuing that.
Okay.
If I could add a conversation, if I might. One of the things that has come up on many of the planning studies that I've done over the last 18, 20 years is this idea that flow is very important, and it is. But as Mike said, what we're trying to do, aside from controlling the flow, is make sure that we have a process that can handle the loads that are coming in, the organic loads, and treat those. And with all of those organic loads, you have other contaminants that are coming to the plant. And in my experience, in particular in Northern California, there were constituents that were regulated there to a much lower level than maybe DEQ has gotten around to. And this is an unintended consequence of water conservation. It doesn't always benefit the wastewater plant because you have water that has higher concentrations of those pollutants. So I'm not saying that water conservation isn't good, because I think it is. I'm just pointing out that that's something that needs to be looked at very carefully, and you need to watch it at the wastewater plant, which is why we look at the loads very, very closely. And for the analysis that we do, that's often more important in some ways.
So Dave, one thought I also had was, looking at the fact that the flows and loads increase is greater than the population increase. Is that also because we're looking at, non-residential sources, right?
We do have non-residential sources in there. I guess, this is something that the Commissioner Mesbus brought up that, we want to take a good hard look at and make sure that everything's in line. But yes, that's true. There's the prison component, and then the other industrial, commercial uses within the service area, and that's not reflected in the population numbers.
Yeah,
your industrial didn't grow much. It seemed like it may be commercial.
Right. Right. I need to go take a harder look at the flow and loads analysis and look at what we're doing with the land uses and how that evolved.
What was surprising to me is I don't know that we have, canning or a brewery or anything like that with high BOD kind of load to the treatment plant. But there may be industrial uses out there that have output that don't come up because we don't, as citizens, residents, we don't know what we're dealing with there. All of my questioning was really to zero in on this business of whether or not our growth projection is lowballed or whether we have higher growth and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
The metro numbers are definitely low and on the low end, so that's why we're going to be looking more closely at the medium projections on this graph, the green line. Which
historically they have been. The other aspect of that is that the city has some say in how fast it grows. And so, some of the costs that you're showing in your cost chart there are the cost of growth. And I think, perhaps we should be thinking about all of these things in addition to the expansion of road systems and this, that, and the other thing, that yes, there are costs when we choose to grow, and we need to be strategic about that. But the point I was making is, since you've already been conservative, and since there appears to be, now you're going to check it and maybe it'll sort itself out, but it appears that you have enough wiggle room in your conservatism to cover more than what Metro is projecting. I'm trying to make sure that we don't pile conservatism on conservatism on conservatism, that in my experience in facilities planning sometimes ends up in overbuilding unnecessarily that goes unused in the long term.
Right.
And that is a concern of mine as well. It's difficult to get a process engineer to not be conservative, because nobody wants to underplan. I see you chuckling, but
it's your failure, right?
It's also very important for the community to pay very close attention to who is responsible for paying for which elements of the need. Yep. Absolutely. And, there's some elements here, unfortunately, that may not be driven by capacity, that may be driven by, performance. But there's an element of capacity that's embedded in that, even in that large dryer unit, that somebody will benefit from other than simply the existing user. So.
Well, and the good thing is, because in the near term we don't appear to have a capacity issue, we can keep track of what growth actually looks like over the next 5 years, and and then, you know, we can adjust accordingly. So, in that sense, you know, this is going to be an adaptive plan, I'm sure, you know, as it's pretty typical. I mean, we've gone longer than normal on doing this plan, you know, 10 years since the last upgrade. I would expect that it'll be a shorter time frame before we go and take another look at, you know, maybe after 5 years or so, what is happening with growth, and do we need to make adjustments to this?
One of the things that would have been helpful in your analysis and in your report, and maybe in the unabridged report is there, it would have been helpful to me is to have a full build-out analysis. Because, you know, population, yeah, okay, so there's projection of population. But the question is, as we build out the areas that are added to the city, do we have adequate capacity, or are we going to have capacity that is going to be unused by the time the equipment needs to be replaced because it's not useful anymore, without having really been used? So that would be a waste of taxpayer money or ratepayer money. A full build-out analysis and timeline for it would provide some idea of whether or not we are tracking the growth of our facility in locksteps with the expected build-out of the areas added to the urban area.
Dave, do you recall offhand, did we consider build-out in any of these as projection curves?
The flows and loads have been projected out to those projection curves, and so we have those. The analysis of the plant early on, the decision, you know, in conjunction with city staff was not to necessarily plan around those build-out numbers for the reasons that you have pointed out. And if we were to take that tack and we were to go back and say, what would it take? We don't know for certain what we would conclude if we look at the build-out numbers, but it would be a more intense treatment plant site for sure at that facility, because you're nearly doubling the population if you look at the projection on that higher rate curve. But if that had been the approach taken, you would have seen, I would think, from us, something along the lines of what is laid out before you.
Well, but Dave, build-out doesn't... Build-out is kind of unrelated to the rate of growth. We don't know when we'll hit it, but if just looking at the current city boundaries and then reserve areas, whatever, at some point, the ways those areas are all zoned are going to max out, and they're going to fill up.
Right.
We don't know when that might happen. I mean, that could be 50 years or something, you know, but there's a number associated with
right.
That's in kind of not necessarily tied to a time frame. It's more tied to, you know, land use, right?
Mike, we can tie it to a time frame. Your planning department has some idea of how fast these neighborhoods are going to develop.
Yeah, and I was just doing some quick research. We've got 1,680 units planned for town center.
Frog Pond's going to be 5,000 people. That's within the 20,000.
We have 1,750 units in Frog Pond East and South. So you put those two together at 2.5 people per unit, that's 8,500 residents, just on developments that we know are going to happen, likely between now and 2045.
And we've got Coffee Creek and Basalt Creek that are going to be built out in probably this 20-year period as well. Now, that's, again, more industrial. That's what we know about that's going to happen in this growth period.
I would really like to see this expected growth chart reflect the planning that we know is already in progress. And if you did that, that takes us from 27,000 up to almost 37,000 just with the known development for Frog Pond East and South and Town Center. And that doesn't include the Frog Pond West that's not included in this population growth. So I think that should be our standard curve, and then there is another curve up there that addresses the potential additional growth that may come in. And then the other thing my thought is,
right?
Yeah, fair. Yeah, absolutely. And then from that, I think we need to be explicit in our conservatism. And the fact that right now we've got a 12% population growth from 2021 to 2045, but a 30% increase in load, I think that should be explicit, especially as we go forward to council. And I would love it if that content was there in advance, because we need to be explicit as to why we're saying it's twice as much as the population growth. That's a big deal.
All right. I think Dave and Mike, if you have clear direction, I would just do a time check here as well. And if there's any other specific guidance you'd give Mike and Dave, let's do that real quick. And then I suggest, Chair, we move on with the agenda.
Yeah, I think Commissioner Gallagher, any additional input on your side?
I had two questions. You've just explored the first one, which I was concerned too about the growth projections in Frog Pond. So thank you for that. I have a simple question. You mentioned a company, Jacobs.
Mm-hmm.
Can you be more explicit? Is that Jacobs Engineering?
Well, yes, they...
I know Jacobs Engineering. That's why I'm asking.
Yeah, they...
From Pasadena. Okay.
Right. They took over CH2M Hill, the company that had the design, build, operate contract for the treatment plant. And so they are now our contract operator.
Wonderful. Joe Jacobs was a dear friend, so good to know.
Okay.
In good hands.
Before I let you go, the chairman said we are getting to the end of this conversation. If and when you do these different projections of population, please show 30 years of data that then you're projecting 30 years down the line. Do not give me 5 years that then you project 25 years down the line. Statistics, that's not defensible.
So go back a little farther in time.
Not only a little farther, the same number of years as you're projecting ahead, so that there's parity. Otherwise, the last 5 years may have been a growth spurt that we are just extending into 30 years in the future, when that's really not accurate. Especially in a small city like this, growth is choppy. So you want to average it out and see what the longer kind of trends are.
Okay.
Okay. Well,
we appreciate everybody's input.
Yeah. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for the presentation, and look forward to seeing the revisions as we move forward here in the process.
Great. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
All right, Mr. Pauly, looks like you're up next for Frog Pond East and South.
Yeah, did you want to take a quick break first or plow right into it?
I'm not seeing anybody shake their head up and down, so let's do it.
All right, I'll walk across the room. Can you hear me well from here?
Yes, that's great.
Okay. Okay, so work session number 6, here we are. Have some additional things to talk to you about tonight. Let me make sure my video's on. All right, here I am. Mandy, if you could change my name while I start to talk. Thank you. So, what we wanted to cover this evening was a brief review of housing design types. We didn't really get into this much last work session. I know council had some additional questions that I think the answer for them will benefit the commission as well as what do these different design types mean. And I'll mention that this is still, this isn't set in stone at this point. We have like precedents from Villabon and such that we're basing this on, but this is still part of the discussion, the policy of really what is contained about these design types. I mean, I'll share kind of where staff is and the project team is generally on this, but if there's input around housing design types and what should be included in that, we can discuss that. We'll bring back, based on your comments last work session, the draft master plan preferred alternative. Again, this is also not set in stone. We'll continue to take this to city council and out to the community to continue to refine, but it's a starting point, and I think based on all the concepts and policies that we've talked about and got support from the council and DRB, council and planning commission, that it's based on that. And I think we're at a good point, but still opportunities to continue to refine. And building on that and getting ready to write policy and zoning code here in the coming months, we really want to get into policy options around how to ensure the city's goals and policy objectives around housing variety can actually be met through regulation or supported through regulation. So going back a couple work sessions to design concepts, just want to reiterate these. I mean, the commission is becoming very familiar with these, but I think it helps to just reiterate how really these are guiding what we're doing. The housing variety throughout, the affordable housing being integrated throughout, as well as this transect and urban form that I'll talk about more, had a similar to Villabon, where you have a larger, denser looking urban form kind of fanning out to a lower density looking urban form. And as we talked about these things, this concept of zooming out and zooming in, I wanted to make sure that hit this, and because this becomes an important point when we're talking both in the variety as well as the transect. What I mean by this is, the map you're seeing is a large, broad scale where, we have 3 colors on the map. But each of those colors, when you zoom in and get more granular, represent a lot of different product types that are all mixed together within that. And also there's kind of mini transects within those areas as well, where, there may be slightly more intense development around a small neighborhood green space and then fans out a little bit, but that's all part of that larger scale fanning. I just want to pause. Am I making sense with this concept of kind of zooming out versus zooming in?
Yeah, that's a good clarification, I think.
Yep, I like it.
Okay. So let's talk about the 3 housing design types, because understanding what kind of we're meaning by this is important as we get into policy. And I will mention, I delved right in without introducing my team here, the consultant team. So Joe, Samya, Andrew are all here again to help with our discussion tonight. So I'll talk about these design types. I'll turn it over to them to talk about the preferred alternative, and then I'll be back to me and kind of talk through policy, variety policy options with their support. So the design types, one way we found, based on further thought by us as well as council feedback, is how to really discuss this. One way is to really, first of all, understand what's the same and what's different between the design types. What are commonalities? What are differences? So the first one is there's variety in unit types. And the best example of kind of what is meant by this is if you think of the village center, where you have, in Villalba, where you have condo and apartment buildings next to townhouses, next to single-family homes, right in close proximity. That type of variety is the sort of thing that we're thinking about, and that we've heard, the project team has heard from the commission and others, that we really want to see variety like that. You don't see that sort of variety in most other, even Villalba further out at that level. So it's. Right. So really thinking of the village center as kind of a model of the type of variety that we may see even in lower density urban forms in this area. And that's tied to the second point, limited isolation of unit types. It's not, this side of the roads, townhouses, this side of the roads, small cottages. It's, they're mixed all together in different ways. But within that, there is some consistency of building bulk and setbacks within a design type, within this type 1, 2, or 3. So that consistency, that though there are different types of units, and introduces some interest kind of in urban form by being different types of units, there's also some consistency that ties them together and doesn't look too hodgepodgey, for lack of a better word. Also, this idea that housing is organized consistently around focal points of gathering spaces and focal points, and has some purpose, and what it's facing is just not placed wherever. The other commonalities is that as regards to unit type, is each of these has some unit types. I'll get into this more in future work sessions, as it gets it can get a little complex in an initial explanation. But there's a lot of questions we've heard from the community, from Planning Commission, as well as City Council, about cottages and tiny homes, because there's a lot of interest in these from a policy standpoint as first-time homebuyer opportunities. And each of these would allow, on front level, allow cottages and tiny homes. It'd come together in different ways. Sometimes it'd be like a cluster housing versus on individual lots, or where there's larger units, more ADUs. And I'll get a bit more into that on policy, but know that, that as we're talking about variety in unit types, there's opportunities for these small scale units that there's a lot of interest in from a policy standpoint throughout these different design types. So how are they different then? So different bulk of buildings. This includes height and facade length and just how it looks from the street. Setbacks, how close it is to the street, how far it is between the different buildings. Lot size, which we'll use generally, but when we say lot size, we're really meaning the ratio of land per structure. And also how vehicle access and off-street parking locations. If there's a front driveway versus whether it's primarily parking behind alley-loaded structures. So let's get into some examples. You had these in your packet, but I wanted to give a bit more color commentary here on these different structures as we've thought through it, kind of what are precedent. And so for design one, again, this is kind of the most intense urban feeling design type. Probably expect something like this, the classic 4-unit, 3-story townhouse that you find in Villalba. These are different considered, like this one, though it's also a 3-story, it has a little bit more setback, and just the design makes it actually look smaller scale slightly. And then just different designs of the townhouses. All note that these are all oriented towards the street rather than around like parking courtyards, which would be the intent to keep kind of that theme that we feel from an urban design standpoint is a success in Villebois and was able to be implemented. This is a similarly shaped building, but this is single level condo units, elevator served. And this is another way that even in the type 1 that these smaller units that are accessible can be constructed as well, besides having individual cottages, having stacked flats that are elevator served. It also includes single-family homes. As those familiar with the Village Center know, there's a number of single-family homes there, including 2- and 3-story, that they tend to be closer together, small lots, alley loaded. So that sort of product would also be something that type of home would also be likely built quite a bit in addition to attached townhouses in a type 1 area. So type 2, moving on to type 2. So this is an example of, this is an interesting example, this is a little wider than you'd normally expect from type 2, but it's a wider building that's on a shallow lot. It's actually a fairly small lot. This is actually a 3-unit townhouse building. Many of you are probably familiar with this, right at by the park on Villebois Drive. But it's on a fairly small piece of land with 3 units. Then you have a lot of, this type 2, this larger alley-loaded type home would be a type 2 as some possibility for front garage oriented homes based on kind of lot size and width of the building is really what's defining it at this point. And then moving into actually a lot of what you see in Morgan Farm, in Frog Pond West would fall into a type 2 category. Now, these are 4,000 or 5,000 square foot lots that primarily with a pretty large lot coverage. Here's a single story example. So again, there's a preponderance, when we talk about height, we're not thinking at this point that any of the types would have a minimum height, but you tend to, if you allow the height, that there's in the type of product that is dominant will tend towards a certain height, but there still be a variety of heights in each of these, such as the single level alley loaded home, which would fall into a type 2 category. Type 3, there's a couple examples here. This could arguably be in a couple different ones, but use this as a good example, as this is the ratio of land, the size of land that this is on is more that type 3 size. It's 4 units. It's only 2 stories, which is similar to kind of the height of a structure you'd expect to see in type 3. And it's a similar width of a larger detached single-family home. Similarly, here's a 2-unit example that, this could easily be the size of a large detached single-family home on a larger lot. Here's another example. Again, this one looks pretty dense because of the architecture, but still kind of the 2 stories and kind of the perspective this photo was taken from as well. But it's 2 stories on a plots of land that would be similar. It would be a larger, like 7,000 to 8,000 square foot piece of land. Again, similarly scaled. If you had a larger home, it may have more architectural interests, but that's where we get into the architectural standards that we worked with on middle housing that will still continue to apply in Frog Pond East and South Langley. Here's what you might think predominantly in type 3, a detached single-family home, but it's a much wider detached home that's larger, on a larger 7,000 plus square foot lot. Here's another example, different architecture. And so that's just a sampling of kind of what's in the team's mind of when we're talking about these, we're talking about a variety of uses, and we're really talking about the bulk of the building and how far it is apart from each other. And those are some examples that could fall into kind of as currently we've defined or drafted those categories. So if it's okay, let's hold questions and go ahead and get into the preferred land use alternative. So I'll turn it over to Joe, and just let me know when you want me to advance slides. I'll obviously advance to the first slide here. So Joe, or I don't know if some
thank you, Dan.
Or others will start here.
So I'll start here. Hello, commissioners. Good to see you. The alternatives on the screen, this is where we were last month, and your feedback was very helpful. We carried it forward to the city council, and we can come back to this slide if you'd like to compare, but let's go to the next one. In very summary form, what we heard from the Planning Commission was you were supportive of south of Advance Road, similar to Alternative C. That means that there would be some type 1 in the south neighborhood along with 2 and 3. North of Advance Road and kind of the heart of the east neighborhood would be similar to Alternative C, and you had a discussion about whether the type 1, the brown on this map, should be more oriented to the center of the neighborhood or to the edge. I'll speak to that in just a moment, Stafford Edge. And a general recognition and support for Alternative C, that it was going the correct direction in support of equitable housing objectives, the affordable housing targets that we've talked about, and providing variety throughout the plan. So let's go to the next slide. Here is what we're calling the preferred alternative. And let me take you through some of the colors, but I think the high level comment here is that the aspirations to create and connect special destinations within these neighborhoods is still a underlying principle and part of the physical planning, and to do that with not only creating those places, but connecting them in many ways. So I'll start with the red on the map, which is our neighborhood commercial center, a little over 3 acres, focused on Brisbane Street per your discussion. And since that time, we've had input from our traffic team and connected with Zach Weigel in engineering. The thinking, subject to transportation analysis, but the current thinking is that a roundabout at that location would serve the access to the main street as the best intersection form. It needs study. There are some physical constraints with fitting it. It would probably be a little bit offset, frankly, to the direct line of Stafford Road. But that is part of sort of the importance of Brisbane that emerges with this concept for the plan. Because if you can follow your mind's eye from Stafford Road, where the traffic circle is, over to the right, the connection between the east-west connection there of Brisbane as it connects to the extension of Frog Pond Lane and 60th. And Dan, I don't know if you can use the cursor to do a little cursor cartography here, but the Brisbane extension to the east becomes more important as a part of the plan, even to the point where the team is thinking it would be classified a neighborhood collector, and that informs the placement of the park, which is central in this version of the plan, as opposed to right adjacent to Main Street.
Exactly.
So that the connection of Brisbane over to the rest of the street system is direct and sort of pulls it all together. So that's Brisbane and the neighborhood commercial component of the plan. The type 1 uses have been placed in kind of the central portion of the east neighborhood. You can think of that as 1 block east of Stafford Road. We felt that one reflected some of the feedback we had from you. Secondly, was a nice bringing together of Brisbane, Main Street, the park, and kind of the rest of the neighborhood. And then there was a comment and brief discussion at the end of your meeting last time about the scale of homes that would be directly adjacent to Stafford. And should we consider that the homes on the west side of Stafford in Frog Pond West are likely to be 2-story, single family nature, and would it be better to have type 2 as a more kind of compatible use across the street? We have run with that idea. Type 2, of course, will have flexibility for several building forms, but it was part of the thinking of placement of the type 1 as it's shown on the map, and then basically the wrapping around of type 2 uses in the east neighborhood where you see the kind of intermediate mustard yellow color. North end of the plan, Colley Road, basically reflects alternative C. That is likely to be developed in more the out years of the plan, which is sort of good for middle housing. And so the middle housing component up there, we're hoping will be successful in that there will already be some momentum started with the development form in other parts of the plan. And then I think the south neighborhood sort of speaks for itself. It includes the small node of type 1 and then transecting out to type 2 and type 3. The street plan here, it was pretty consistent between all of the alternatives, but we did run with the extension of Frog Pond Lane to 60th. I think we need to name that street at some point, but I'll call it the extension right now. And if you could use the cursor again, Dan, we're basically bringing it with a little bit of dimension between the street alignment and the BPA easement for the purpose of having a double-loaded street, which is sort of a little bit more familiar development form. It gives us a design study to do to make sure that we get the design guidance correct for that area there. So I think we can think of it as an area of study as we move ahead. But that was one street aspect of the plan I wanted to point out to you. And I think the rest of the connectivity is a bit self-described. So I'll stop there and ask Soumya if you could, any observations or points I might have missed as we drew the plan?
Yeah, I think you covered it all really well. I would just say this is, again, kind of tied to the idea of distributed centers of density and building form, and reiterating that there are multiple diverse varieties of housing types within each of those, what may look like large blocks of a singular land use. But the idea too being that the affordability piece, that there's an opportunity for multiple types of affordable product in multiple different places throughout the neighborhood, which I think gets at that kind of equitable distribution of different types of housing and affordability. And then we did kind of do a closer study of the dimension between the street extension of Frog Pond Lane and the BPA easement So that's enough space to maybe get an alley behind there so that there's more of a public frontage along the BPA easement, and we're really being thoughtful about where we're showing the little street connections to make sure that there are public connections through at sort of a regular interval along the street to the BPA. And then also just the way that we've laid out the land uses is really thinking about a smaller block size so that as this place develops, we're not ending up with singular large kind of swaths of housing that don't feel fully connected, but rather that there's streets and trails and sidewalks and abilities to get multiple places from multiple places throughout the city area.
And I'll just add on to Soumya's comment about whereas the coloring kind of convention here shows areas of brown, areas of orange, and so on, it's really your policy discussion later in the meeting that it is about how do we get the richness of variety within those colors. Okay. It's new ground. We don't have the we're not the master developer like we have in Villebois, and so how do we replicate the best of that in the public standards and zoning ordinance kind of technique. Commissioner Carr, is it okay if we cover one more topic and then we'll get to yours? Okay, great. So let's just finish by going to the next couple of slides. And Andrew, if you could give us some highlights about what the numbers are looking like.
All right, yeah, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
So just a quick overview of the housing capacity, what we're looking at when we turn all those colors on the map into numbers of units. We're basically looking at about 1,100 units in the east neighborhood, about 500 units in the south neighborhood, which brings us to an overall total of about 1,600 units. We have started to look at kind of transportation and infrastructure, and we're using what we call a reasonable worst case for impacts to roads and infrastructure. And so we're looking at about 1,800 units overall for both neighborhoods there. But as we do a little bit of math to figure out how many of these units are going to be, single detached units versus attached units and middle housing versus multi-dwelling units, you see the breakdown on right here in this pie chart. So we're looking at a little bit less than half of all units coming in as single-family detached, and then the remainder split about 12% multifamily and 41% attached and middle. And on the next slide, we talk about kind of how we arrived at those assumptions here. This isn't a policy decision on housing mix. It's kind of our best guess at this point, based on what the intent of these design types are and what we think developers will likely want to build in these areas. And these percentages are kind of a number of units, not exactly a land area. So type 1 is where we're saying, maybe we'll see 50% of those be developed as multi-unit dwellings, so condos, apartments, any kind of subsidized affordable apartment buildings would fall in that category. And then the other 50% split between single detached and middle housing. Type 2, we're saying, is probably more of a 50-50 split between the attached type and single detached, and then type 3 is mostly detached with a little bit of kind of middle housing in between there. You'll notice these are nice round numbers, and these are kind of fairly high-level estimates that we're using for infrastructure planning purposes. But we can have a more detailed discussion about how do we achieve these within these design types, and where does the city want to go in terms of encouraging or requiring certain types of development?
So, and I will defer to you as to whether this is a discussion point or whether the presentation.
Yeah, I think let me go back to the actual map, and I would suggest we defer most discussion until after we get through the most part, because it's interrelated. But if there's comments directly to the map right now in kind of the broad level, the high level coloring, that's great. So it looks like Commissioner Carr has a comment, if that's okay, Chair.
Yes, So as I looked at this map, my first thought was that we didn't have enough type 1 in south, but now understanding that 3-unit townhouses can fit into both type 1 and type 2, I think we're fine. So understanding that the mix within the type allows us some flexibility with the mins and the maxes, I'm comfortable with this map.
A quick question. Where the connection to the easement, BPA easement, is shown as street extensions, those are not really street extensions, are they? They're going to be pocket parks or something?
That's correct. Those the arrows that are currently pointing toward the BPA easement are indicating that there would be some kind of public connection, whether that's an alley or a pocket park.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, there's a possibility. We're still exploring a potential connection kind of on the north end near the Grange across the easement. Still being explored, but outside of that, we wouldn't expect any vehicular access across the easement.
I wasn't thinking vehicular access. I was thinking about
permeability and
pedestrian. I mean, you're showing a trail down the BPA easement.
Yeah.
Or that's what I'm reading anyway. Is that what that arrow, the line with the arrow on it is?
Correct.
In the middle. So if that's going to be a trail of some sort or recreation area in general, it would be good for that long block, the parallel street to the BPA, where those openings are, for it to be windows into that open space between the houses as pocket parks or something like that.
And if I could put that in context a little bit, that is in fact a proposed trail that would parallel the BPA easement as it connects to Stafford Road. And once you can get across Stafford, you are then in the proximity of the northern extension of the Beckman Creek Trail and what Metro is ultimately showing as a trail that would go up into the Stafford Basin. So this connects that area to the larger regional network.
Thank you.
Great. Any other initial questions or comments from the commission on the map?
Soumya, did you have another comment?
Yes, sorry. I just wanted to note that one thing has changed on the land uses. It's a small thing, but we did talk about it last time. There was a portion of what's now shown as school property, because it is a school parcel, that was kind of just south of the future community park, and we had shown that as a type 1 and talked about that as an opportunity, but since then we've had conversations that that property should be considered part of the school district, so we've shown it as such. But we've also gotten some good communication with, I believe, the city traffic engineers and the school district about the trail connections, and so feeling like we're pretty good on showing a trail connection going south and toward Beckman Creek Primary.
Okay, and Soumya, is that, thank you for that explanation, is that why we're seeing a lower number of dwelling count than what we saw on Alternative C last month? So last month we were at, I think, 1,803 dwelling units for Alternative C, and now we're at approximately 1,600, where we were kind of, the focus of this new map was kind of taking the portions of Alternative C and doing a little mixing and matching. Wasn't sure if that reduction in overall buildable area was what was driving that reduction in number of units.
Soumya, I can speak to that a little bit. I think that parcel is part of it, Commissioner, but probably the larger cumulative effect is we've gone from fuzzy lines to a little bit more hard lines that have some block thinking to them. And so as we fit type 1 to actual conceptual block formation and areas, we ended up with the amount of type 1 that we have.
Okay.
Good question. Okay. So I think going into the housing variety policy options, this is more, as I talked about, zooming into those individual blocks and colors and creating policy about how you create mix and variety within that. So some key points to consider that are in the staff report, but just want to highlight a couple here briefly, that we're really talking about regulating unit type, not price point. It really, the requirements do help ensure middle housing is implemented rather than, just defer to developer preference. And with that, just based on, it can vary greatly based on which developers are at play, but there's a good chance that based on prior experience that there'd likely be limited variety without some sort of requirement. However, that said, we don't want to over-regulate and get too granular and rigid. Flexibility is important. Our experience implementing the Wilsonville Village Master Plan showed us that. When we talk variety, it is best regulated in what we kind of called in Wilsonville and would continue to use as a concept is buckets, where we take different unit types and kind of group them together. And there's some flexibility within that, but they have kind of the same intent. And also, we need to develop regulations that are clear and objective. So that all said, I'd present kind of 4 draft policy options just kind of consider. The first one is encourage only. So zone for it, allow for it, design for it, but then ultimately leave the decision on variety up to individual developers. The second option would be a minimum of target housing types. So for example, if you want to make sure there's single level accessible units requiring a certain percent or number of those per sub-district or block, I have to be careful with that it's not fall into category of inclusionary zoning per se. But there's that. There's also the other way to look at it is the maximum individual housing type. So assuming there's going to be a preferred housing type by the developer for any given chunk of land, that they can only build a maximum of X percent of individual of a certain housing type. And this said, I'm kind of talking broadly. I want to take a moment. I'm talking broadly about these concepts. I haven't thrown any percentages out yet. Based on guidance we get here and from council next week, we'll then move into providing some actual percentage options and kind of showing examples of that. But I wanted to kind of general approach is what we're after today. The fourth option would be really to combine 2 and 3. So if there's some target units that we feel really would be underproduced by the market, but are still buildable at a market rate and by the market, then we can put in a minimum amount. But at the same time, for the rest, to encourage variety, to have a maximum, so there's not too much uniformity and there is a variety of units throughout the plan. So really that combination of 2 and 3 is recommended, to have inclusion of a minimum amount of target housing types that the decision makers and the community can designate, and then also to max put a ceiling on how many of the same units could be built in a certain area. So that is all I'll say on that, assuming you've read your packet. So then really in the time we have left, which isn't much, but we'll take what we need here, what the commission wants to take, is what other questions or ideas does the Planning Commission have about the design types? Really want to see if there's any additional feedback there. Any additional feedback on the direction that the preferred alternative is going, And then really, should the city require a certain mix of housing, and which approach generally should we take? And then other questions about housing variety in particular that you'd like the project team to be prepared to answer in our next work session. And Joe, anything to add before we turn it over to the commission?
No, not for me.
Okay. Back to you, Chair.
All right, we'll jump into it. Thank you. Commissioner Willard.
Yeah, I just had a general question. Do you have based on your experience, Mr. Pauly, how many development or individual developers do you imagine being used in this area? Is it 4? Is it 14? I just don't have a sense of how many development applications you would get for this. It's a fairly small area compared to Villebois.
Sure. And the whole area is actually kind of similar to Villebois. I mean, when you take into West. So, I mean, I can use the example of Villebois. Ultimately, Villebois, you had a couple small players, but the main player, most of it was developed by 4 developers. Frog Pond West, there'll be some smaller developers that may come into play, but like the land use components were really, again, 3 to 4 different players is what ultimately we'll see. So, maximum 4 or 5, I would say here. Obviously on the north, kind of in east, you're not going to see as many because it's large tracts of land that will be controlled ultimately by 1 or 2 developers likely, versus, there's more opportunity for some consolidation, but probably we'll see a couple more, potentially some smaller scale projects in the south portion.
Okay. I'm just curious about it had anything bearing on the recommendation, but it doesn't sound like it does. It was more of just like a curiosity. But I'm curious to hear some of the other commissioners' comments. But with prior to hearing that, I think proceeding with your recommendation of option 4 makes sense to me.
Thank you, Willard. All right, Commissioner Carr.
Yeah, I'm also of the opinion of option number 4, but I have a question within that is, by specifying a minimum and a max, would you have to do a minimum and a max for each of the housing categories within the type, or could we just attach a max to like the detached single family?
Yeah, I mean, it's adjustable. You don't have to make sure that each bucket is in each block. You could say, okay, and it could vary based on how large the subdistrict is or kind of the context. Is like, this area we want to see at least 2, but this is an area we really want to see a bigger diversity. So we should see 3 or 4 in this large block.
I think when we get into the question of affordable housing, it's the detached single family that's going to push things out of that. So if we put a max on at least those, then I think they'll get the idea. As far as requiring versus suggesting, I think we're going to have to require it if we're going to meet any of the affordable housing, equitable housing initiatives that the city has. If we just leave it up to them, I think we're going to see detached single-family houses, because that's what's going to make them the most money.
That's true. Okay.
Commissioner Wood?
Yeah, like the other commissioners, I like the recommended positioning on this. I think it's a good balance, with meeting HB 2001, and then it also provides a limit range of housing types so that we have a balance. However, what I would like to see is in these single-family detached homes, tiny homes. I'd like to see some options there and maybe even a requirement of some of these if we've got some builders that will build those. But I think we should offer that because of the affordability for first-time home buyers. So that's the only other, addition that I would add to this. But I like everything else that has been said.
Commissioner Gallagher.
Yeah, I'm of the same mind. I think that we need to be very clear about the minimum standards that we have in terms of what it is that we feel needs to be done. Because I think if we just make suggestions, profit will overrule standards. So I think, isn't that option number 4? I think.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
All right. Thank you. Commissioner Mesbah.
I am good with the recommended option by the staff. As they were going through the slides of different types and so forth, to me, it's very clear that articulation of the facade makes such a big difference in how the space feels and looks at the end. I'm not sure that we're talking about that level of design at this point, and I don't know whether we ever will.
So we have a couple models to go off of there, Commissioner Mesbah. We have what we did with middle housing, and we adopted some articulation standards there, as well as there's some articulation standards that we can build off of in Frog Pond. So there's definitely those sort of things already on the books that would be incorporated, and we can look at that to see if there's anything that needs to be tweaked there.
Good. That's great. Again, though, as I think about these things, I also have to remind myself that all these bump outs and coves and so forth will add to the cost of construction, and we're also talking about affordability. But I would hate to see blank walls for the affordable housing and better looking stuff. There's an approach to affordable housing that says real affordable housing needs to be really well designed, because otherwise you're paying in maintenance and other things. So I'm hoping it will all fall in place to be a really harmonious and coherent kind of look for the neighborhood.
Mr. Parrish, I noticed that you've got your hand up. What do you have?
Yeah, just a follow-up question for Commissioner Woods. You mentioned tiny homes as maybe another housing type we could encourage or be part of the required mix. What counts as a tiny home to you? Is it a square footage of the lot that you're thinking of?
Sure. Well, typically when you look at tiny homes and the...
One room.
Am I on mute?
Nope, we can hear you.
Okay, I'm sorry. And when you look at those, we're talking around 499 square feet, probably to a maximum of maybe 899 in square footage. That's what I'm thinking of, and what I've seen in the tiny home types. Also, I want to be clear that I'm not talking about a tiny home that is not a home that has all of the things that we have in a larger scale home. It's just smaller in size and also in cost.
Commissioner Carr, I see your hands up.
Yeah. For future work sessions, I would kind of like to see what Villebois break down in different, within the different types that there are within Villebois, because I think that is a pretty good representation of what we would like to see, because I think it's, other than the fact that the streets are a little narrow for me, I think it's a really nice housing development.
It's well done.
And then just as a side note, in the urban renewal, we were also talking about any tax incentive funding or tax incremental funding that might help with affordability of some of Frog Pond as well. So that's something that will probably come in at some point, because obviously the urban renewal, we just started talking about that. But we might be able to use some type of tax incremental funding to help with some of the HB 2001 affordability stuff. But yeah, for future, I'd like to see the stats on billable.
Okay.
Okay, yeah, and from my perspective, yeah, I think requiring a certain mix of housing is the only way to go realistically. I like the idea of the focus on the maximum number of single-family homes. It's an interesting concept that I would like to, I think should be investigated further. The one thing that I wasn't sure about on a maximum number of any of the product types is how do we do that in a way that doesn't penalize the later developers? So if you have all of the initial early developments taking up all those housing units, then that means that there's none available for everybody else. So making sure that we have some mechanism that's not too complicated to help ensure that the later development doesn't get penalized.
Yeah, I think the geographies we base these standards on would have to assume that it's done by each geography we're talking about is done by a single developer. That'd be kind of the intent, but yeah.
Okay, that's helpful. And then I think option 4, I think a blend is good. The one thing that I would be interested from a housing variety policy perspective for future work sessions would be if there's examples of this being successful somewhere else, I would love to understand what those policies were. So if there's any other areas that have already been through this, or if we're the first in the world, or at least say the U.S., great, I'm okay with being a trailblazer, but if not, it would be nice to understand what other policies might have been successful elsewhere that we could use as a template for here.
So far, our research is showing us we're trailblazers.
I guess that makes sense given the state we're in. Okay, I'll take it. All right, anything else from the commissioners? All right, Mr. Polly, did you get what you need from this?
Yes, thank you.
All right. Well, with that, thank you, Mr. Polly and team for Frog Pond East and South Master Plan discussion. I look forward to the next one. Okay, let's see. Next one up, Mr. Polly, looks like we've got outreach framework.
Yeah, and I can be fairly brief on this and just kind of leave it to as much additional discussion as you want. This has been a really trailblazing, but really interesting as well. Work through. I missed out on your last work session on this, being out of the office unexpectedly in May, but really wanted to update you on what's happened since May. Mr. De La Cruz and Ms. Noyes have concluded their contract work, and so we kind of have a final product that is not a final product. Is still, the city can update it as needed over time, but wanted to kind of share what has happened since May, since your last work session, and discuss it as much or as little as is your preference. So let me pull up this other presentation here. So again, the title of this is the Wilsonville Framework for Inclusive Engagement. And the overall purpose is really engage the community in decisions that impact them and engage them in more more meaningful, early way. And with this increased support, as well as involvement of historically underrepresented communities and individuals. And also to be consistent, fair, and accessible, and in encouraging participation. And also, I'll share a couple little stories here, but also encourage collaboration. For example, some of the outreach we're planning, we're still working on how it's coming together. There's potential that we're going to work with the school district as we talk about the public realm and outreach for that. I've talked to the school district because they're doing their campus design of the new primary school right now, as well as our engineering teams working on what the streetscape may look like for the Beckman Road corridor, and bringing that all together for public involvement and having meaningful public involvement are some great opportunities. So it's pretty cool how already some of this and having the training and discussions already starting to see some movement. So back to what we've done since May, the teams incorporated comments from this group, as well as the DEI committee, city council, and city staff. And when I'm saying city staff, I'm not just meaning us planners, but I mean all across the city, from SMART and the library and administration. The team, the consultant team we brought in for this also have been supporting and looking at the outreach we did, particularly in May, for Frog Pond East and South, and giving us feedback on that. We had 4 hours of city staff training. There were two-hour sessions on Tuesday afternoons that were well attended. Again, this wasn't just planning staff. We had most of our engineering staff, natural resource staff. We had the library, a number of folks from SMART, just everyone. And parks, just all these city team members and administration, all the city team members that do outreach, and really had a great discussion and training about these concepts. Another interesting part that was done is interviews with past outreach participants, particularly this included participants in the town youth and people of color that were involved in town center and the middle housing, and really got some, the notes were really interesting and some good feedback, and particularly that got wrapped into the barriers to involvement, to engagement, and the actions that are included in the document. So again, kind of where we ended with the framework overview is it's this general guidance. There's the 6 steps for engagement. It's meant to be flexible. And what I mean by flexible is there's some things where, for example, even housing with Frog Pond, where there's been 2 or 3 previous inputs, and so the kind of the scope of what we're looking at is relatively narrow in a way, versus starting something from a new project from scratch, and just driving to be thoughtful about our designing engagement for each project the city does. So this starts with really defining the problem, really having community before we say, okay, this is a problem, let's go throw together a few suggested solutions and then go see how they stick. But really engaging at the beginning to help define the problem and understanding and listening to have a more in-depth understanding of what the problem is. And then determining what criteria, what does success mean like, brainstorming solutions, evaluating the alternatives based on the agreed upon criteria, really look at trade-offs and the complexities on those trade-offs, and with all that, develop recommendations for decision makers like the Planning Commission and City Council. So I mentioned the designing the process and being really thoughtful about that. a big part of what it is, an important part, is really looking at barriers and actions. And I think it's great that this is in the document to really push those thinking about and designing these engagement processes. You're going to face all these barriers in your process, and what are some ideas? And this is one to overcome them. And I see this as one portion that will continue to evolve and get better to better over time as we continue to say, okay, we've tried this doesn't quite work. How can we continue to build this? Another portion that came out of this, big help from Bill Evans on this as well, is really a menu of options and really identifying what these different options do, right? There's a lot of things that inform. They get the information out there. If someone wants to consume it, they can consume it. But really then getting their input, kind of that bounce back input. And then there's things that actually get engagement where, it's more a conversation, listening and hearing stories and starting from the beginning and really having that impact and involvement. So that is in the document as well. So what the next steps are, we'll presenting this to DEI Committee and City Council in August. We're putting it into projects. There's a lot of interest, already having a lot of additional conversations about how we can do this better. And as I mentioned, this will be a living document that will be continue to be updated. So I will leave it at that. I know I went through it quick, but it's late, and happy to take any comments or discussion.
Okay, looks like Commissioner Carr. Got your hand up?
Yeah, so I think the city has done a good job of engaging with the community in the past, but I think this kind of elevates the game. And I think a focus on underrepresented will help to better serve our entire community and not just the same 10 people that go to all the meetings, right? So I applaud the city's efforts in this because I think it will, in the long run, make our city just that much better.
Okay. Any other comments from the commissioners? Yeah, Commissioner Wood.
Yeah, I had participated on this or in this in the very beginning, and I have to say that the outcome of this in this document is pretty comprehensive. It's very detailed and very specific. And there's some key items in here that will be very difficult to overcome. One of the first things I see is the general interest from the community in itself, and looking at what it is that they want and need. I think we're going to have to do some really deep dives here. Hopefully we've got some community ambassadors that can help to pull groups together and find out exactly what it is that we're missing. And also, I'm a big believer that, the concept of build it and they will come in this scenario or in this objective of what we're trying to do, I don't think will work. So there are multiple attack points, if you will, that I think the city is going to have to approach here. And it's going to take some time. Engaging underrepresented stakeholders here is going to be extremely important. So I'll just say that a lot of things, a lot of good, this is an excellent document. I think we're going to have to really do this deep dive and look at how it is that we can tie together some of these needs, but we have to understand what is it that our community and our underserved communities specifically need, and also find a good way to bring them out. Some of the things that were talked about in here, getting individuals to meetings. Maybe some of them can't travel to meetings. So having still the Zoom access, and even in that case, some people don't have access to Zoom.
Exactly.
we do, you know. So at any rate, I just think this is a good document. There's just a lot of really key things here that we need to key in on to really make this, the objectives that the city has work.
Thank you.
Mr. Mesmer.
I wanted to kind of second Commissioner Wood's statements. As I was looking at this document, I was very pleased at the meat on the bones. And it occurred to me once we got to the engagement of stakeholders, it occurred to me that we are dealing with a general citizenry that is disinterested until something is proposed and they all of a sudden become interested because it catches their attention. And throughout the country, communities are finding out that you need to build that kind of engagement and community spirit into a functioning democracy at a small scale. And the DEI committee, part of the kind of impetus behind pushing for it was to have a committee that is focused on building that kind of rapport with the community and that kind of outreach, with especially with the underrepresented communities. And, you know, something in the back of my head said, perhaps if we build engagement with the underrepresented portions of the community, the rest of the community will also get interested, because the effort necessary to do that kind of work will have spillover effects throughout the community. And I have mentioned this before, that we as the Planning Commission need to also be thinking about building that level of engagement is part of our work job description. We are the outreach committee. And just to have, you know, as this document says, just to have public hearings isn't outreach. We need to come up with some ideas of engaging portions, neighborhoods, portions of the community on different issues perhaps, and going out there instead of expecting that they're going to come to us on the 2 hours on the weekday night that we happen to have scheduled our meetings. So I really wanted to underscore Commissioner Wood's statement that this is heavy lifting, and we need to start brainstorming about how to do it.
That's great. Yes, Ms. Gallagher.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that. It is a heavy lift, and as an ethicist, I just want to point out that, you know, you can have the best of intentions, which I think we all do, and I think everyone is making the effort. But we're trying to overcome something that's based on a sense of trust and respect. And that isn't something that you can just form a committee and put out intentions for. That's something that has to be built over time through action. And it's a very challenging process, especially in this country right now. So I don't want all the good intentions of trying to bring people together to overlook the reason why they feel not included to begin with, because that's just putting a Band-Aid on a problem that's not going to heal.
Yeah, that's good. I'm really happy to see the outreach framework. I think it's a great step towards helping to ensure that we are consistent in how the city reaches out and solicits input. I think, you know, one of the keys for me is that focus on steps 1 and 2 and making sure that the citizenry are involved in defining the problem and identifying the desired outcome, and making sure that we as the city, in terms of the Planning Commission and in terms of city staff, is really focusing on listening to the entirety of the citizenry in those early steps. You know, we tend to jump to brainstorming solutions where we need to make sure that everybody or that we have a general consensus on defining the problem. You know, I think the Beckman dip for me is a great example of where you talk to residents and there's a significant amount of disagreement that we need a bridge over the dip and that the city's money could be spent elsewhere. And so I think that's an example of we may have been able to do a better job of defining the problem and defining a desired outcome and getting the citizens' involvement up front to help mitigate some of that. And maybe we would have ended up coming to the same solution, but maybe not. And so I'm hopeful that this document can help us make more informed decisions as we move forward.
Well, can I just add something? You know, we talked before about setting a minimum standard for developers in terms of the kind of housing that we want. In a way, we're really talking about this. We're really saying to the citizens of Wilsonville, what kind of town are we? What kind of a place do we want to be? What kind of values and what kind of behavior do we want to reflect that will make people feel welcome here and included? Because it's not that, I mean, it's almost an amorphic thing. How do you put your arms around it unless you set certain standards of behavior and say, you know, there's certain things here we just will not, we don't want to represent this kind of community. This is the kind of community that we want to be, and we want to try to live it every day. Think of our town. It's not just an old-fashioned notion.
Mr. Pauly, what I would recommend is, and maybe you already do this, is I'd love to see the data long-term over the engagement through these 6 steps. You know, is there a particular step that we naturally have the community more engaged in than others? And just use that as a baseline, so that way we know what good looks like, or we know what normal looks like. Then we can measure our progress. And in terms of the diversity, equity, and inclusion, I think it would also be great to understand what parity is. You know, what we know about our mix in our community and what we know about the engagement that we get now. When would we be at parity, whereas a comparable level of engagement to what we have now? And those would be two data figures that I think would be meaningful to understand if we're making progress.
That's helpful.
All right. I'm going to say we're good, unless I'm not seeing anybody else looking to jump in. So thank you for that, Mr. Pauly. Looks like the last 2 items are the City Council minutes and the PC work program. Mr. Pauly, any notes for either of those that you want to bring up?
No. There's a lot more Frog Pond to come on the work program.
Yes, yeah, it sure looks like it. Yeah, looking forward to it, mostly. All right, well, with that, I will see if we have a motion to adjourn.
A motion we adjourn. A second.
All right, we got a motion and a second. With that, we are adjourned at 8:29 p.m. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks all. Good night.
Bye all.
Bye.